Hello, cool cats and kittens. It's Uncle Matt here. Today, we kick off the first video in our video series of Marvel Mondays. And to kick it off, we have to go back.
We have to go back!
To where the Marvel Cinematic Universe started with Iron Man, released in 2008, directed by Jon Favreau, starring Robert Downey Jr. Now, if you didn't do your homework and watch Iron Man to get caught up for this, here's the gist of it. Tony Stark is a billionaire playboy, genius scientist, whose company Stark Industries is the leading manufacturer of weapons in the world. While on a trip to Afghanistan to demonstrate his latest advancement, the Jericho missiles, he is ambushed and kidnapped by members of a terrorist organization known as the Ten Rings. Write that down, that'll come back up later on down the line. While in their possession, the Ten Rings want Tony Stark to build more weapons for them. They're already in possession of a number of his weapons, which he finds shocking because he does not believe his weapons have been sold to unsavory groups such as this. Instead of building the missile that they request, Tony Stark builds the initial Iron Man armor, which he uses to escape captivity and leave their prison. Yeah, that's what happens. Upon returning to America, Tony Stark makes it his goal to end the weapons manufacturing of his company since he can't control whose hands the weapons are going into. He's met with resistance from his business partner, Obadiah Stane. Obadiah Stane believes this is how they make their money, this is how they've always done it, this is what they should continue to do. To fight back against Tony, he actually leads a coup and has Tony removed from the board of directors and declared temporarily unable to do his job so that Obadiah Stane can continue to control things and make sure they continue to sell weapons. Behind the scenes, though, Tony Stark, inspired by what he was able to build in the desert, continues to create the Iron Man armor because while he was in the desert, he developed a miniature version of an arc reactor. This is a technology that Stark Enterprises had been working as an alternative energy source for years, but they had never been able to make it feasible because the only one they could ever design was a big, huge one in a warehouse. Tony came up with the miniature one to power the Iron Man suit, which changed the game. We later learned that not only is Obadiah Stane fighting against Tony in the business world, he's fighting against him personally as well, as he had hired the members of the Ten Rings to kidnap and kill Tony Stark, which they failed to do. They also recovered what was the remaining of his original Iron Man armor and reverse engineered it. Obadiah Stane goes there, takes them out to cover his tracks, and takes the armor so that he can continue to work with it. Knowing that his scientists are not capable of building the miniature arc reactor the way Tony Stark was, Obadiah Stane attacks Tony, paralyzes him, steals the arc reactor to power the suit that he's building, and leaves Tony Stark for dead. Luckily, Stark still has the original miniature arc reactor he designed in the desert. He puts it back in even though it's low power and not going to be able to sustain him for very long, but it gets him through to where he can restart the Iron Man armor and go stop Obadiah Stane. Finally, we have Tony Stark in his Iron Man armor versus Obadiah Stane in his Iron Monger armor. That's the name of the character in the comics, although he's never identified as such in the film. They go head-to-head, climactic battle across Los Angeles. Ultimately, Tony sets off a EMP from the original large arc reactor that disables both their suits and ultimately kills Obadiah Stane. However, luckily, Tony's able to be resuscitated in time before he dies. The movie wraps up with Tony Stark in front of a press conference where he's attempting to explain who this masked, weird robot person was that was battling across his facility. And in the end, he decides rather than cover it up and suggest this was a robotic bodyguard that he hired, he just comes out and says it. I am Iron Man. Cut to credits. But wait, there's more. After the credits, we see Tony Stark wandering through his home. His home AI, Jarvis, is shut down unexplainably. And then, out of nowhere, comes Samuel L. Jackson. No, wait, Nick Fury, to inform Tony Stark that he's not the only superhero out there, and to ask him, have you heard of the Avengers Initiative? Next up, we've got notable notes, a series of notes that I deemed important while I was watching the movie, and wrote them down as such so that I could read them to you. First off, I watched the movie on Disney+. Right at the start of it, there was a warning that the movie featured depictions of tobacco use. I thought that was unique. I don't know if I've ever seen that in a movie before, a warning about tobacco use, although I guess you see that less and less in TV and movies now. So, and being that it's on Disney+, maybe that's something they needed to point out before you get into this, since it's not your traditional Disney-style movie in a lot of senses, but that was interesting to me. Number two, You don't see a Disney logo when the movie starts. You see a Paramount logo. What's up with that? We'll talk about that more later. Tony's origin story for this movie is set in Afghanistan. That has changed throughout the comic timeline. Originally, Tony created the Iron Man armor while fighting in the Vietnam War. That eventually moved to the Gulf War. And now, for the movie, the comics have followed suit and moved it up to Afghanistan. Even though the movie came out in 2008, it doesn't feel that old, except for there's one reference to somebody putting a picture of Tony Stark on their MySpace page, which definitely seems like that was of a time. Does anybody still have a MySpace account? I think I do, but I don't remember what it is. Another thing that stuck out to me in this movie is this is where Tony Stark's facial hair made a major change from the comics. Traditionally, he just had like a regular old mustache. Robert Downey Jr. went with a very unique looking goatee. I don't know if he thought mustache would have looked too odd in a modern movie, but a lot of people unsuccessfully tried to copy the Iron Man goatee in real life, and it definitely plays better on the screen than it does in real life. The character in the comics has also since adapted the Robert Downey Jr. style facial hair, and also the character used to be more of a Bruce Wayne swinging playboy type. He wasn't too comical, but he's turned into more of the comedian type character you see in the movies with Robert Downey Jr.'s portrayal of him. In the movies, Jarvis is an AI that operates Tony's house and helps assist him with the Iron Man armor, whereas in the comics, Jarvis is more of a Alfred the Butler type of character, similar to what Batman has. There's a lot of similarities between Iron Man and Batman when you come to think of it. Interesting. The film's director, Jon Favreau, has a small role in the film, playing Happy Hogan, Tony Stark's chief security officer, the leader of his bodyguards, his driver, kind of jack of all trades sort of person for him. There's an interesting line. I don't know if they had how far ahead they were thinking with this, but there's a line in the movie when Tony Stark's trying to see how high he can get in this flying in the armor, where the AI says something to the effect of, "You're going too high," and he keeps trying to go. And the AI, Jarvis, eventually says something to the effect of, "You need to adjust the specifics of your suit if you're planning for space travel." 5, 6, 7 movies down the line, 20 movies down the line, we do eventually see Iron Man travel into space, and his armor was prepared for it that time, but we'll get to that later. Stan Lee, as he does in all Marvel movies, he has a cameo, and they always tend to try to find a fun, interesting way for him to show up. This one, he's playing a version of Hugh Hefner and has a few blonde ladies on his sleeve at a party that Tony Stark is attending. There's Audis all over this movie. It seemed a little weird. I looked it up. They actually had a deal with Marvel Studios to have the cars used in the movies, so that's why you see way more Audis in these movies than you probably ever do in real life. There is a brief shot in Tony's laboratory where he's working on the Iron Man suit where you can see Captain America's shield sticking out from under a pile of junk. Now, we'll learn in later movies why that was there, what the connection between Iron Man and Captain America was from the get-go, but this was kind of just a tease of a hint of what was to come in the bigger picture. Finally, this is kind of famous, well-known thing at this point in time, the final line, "I am Iron Man," ad-libbed by Robert Downey Jr. Great ad-lib, because it ended up being one of the most significant lines in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, which, we'll get to that in 21, 22 movies from now. We'll see. We'll be there. We'll get there eventually. So now we've all seen the movie. Let's talk about what went into making it become a movie. Let's talk about making the movie. Movies based on superheroes tend to be in some stage of development at all times, particularly now that these have proven to be big-time box office successes. But the Iron Man movie specifically began development around 1990. Originally, Universal Pictures had bought the rights to make an Iron Man movie from Marvel. They eventually gave up on it and sold the rights to Fox, who also gave up on it, sold the rights to New Line Cinemas, before ultimately the rights to the character reverted to Marvel itself, and Marvel would ultimately make the movie. Now, the reason Marvel had given up so many of these rights is there was a big time in the comic book industry where sales collapsed and Marvel actually had to declare bankruptcy, and to save themselves, they sold off a large amount of their characters' licensing rights to be able to make movies to other studios. So the X-Men were at Fox, Spider-Man was at Sony, They were all over the place. Now, the X-Men, Spider-Man, they've always been amongst Marvel's most popular characters, but Iron Man, not so much. So eventually, studios didn't see money in making it. They gave up on it, let the rights go back to Marvel. Marvel worked out a deal with Merrill Lynch Bank to finance their own movies instead of sharing them with other studios, to where that way they get to keep more of the money that they're getting from making the movies. Duh. So they actually worked out a 6-picture distribution deal with Paramount Pictures, where they would finance, make the movies, Paramount would distribute to the studios. Iron Man was the one chosen to be first out of the gates because it was the only one that no live action version had been made of yet, and so they felt it was a fresh way to start and kick things off. But obviously it was a big risk, because if this fails, they're probably gonna have to go back to the drawing board, sell all their characters off again to make all the money back that they had borrowed from Merrill Lynch Bank to do this. Going back to those early 90s attempts to make an Iron Man movie, Nicolas Cage expressed interest in portraying the character. He's expressed interest in playing just about every comic book character ever. He almost was Superman. He eventually became Ghost Rider, which was terrible. Tom Cruise was also interested in the role in the 90s and was in negotiations to produce and star in the movie, but ultimately nothing ever came of that. When Marvel reacquired rights to the character and launched their own attempt to make the movie, Clive Owen, Sam Rockwell, and Hugh Jackman were all considered for the role of Tony Stark before Robert Downey Jr. was ultimately chosen. Now, old school comic book fans might have seen Samuel L. Jackson come out and introduce himself as Nick Fury at the end of the movie and been very confused, because that's not what Nick Fury looks like in the comic books. Well, you're right and you're wrong. When Marvel restarted their universe on a separate line called Ultimate Comics, they introduced an African-American version of Nick Fury who was modeled specifically after Samuel L. Jackson, and even has a line in one of the comics where he says, if they ever make a movie of me, Samuel L. Jackson has to play me. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Years later, Samuel L. Jackson did portray Nick Fury. And of course, that Nick Fury scene started the tradition of every Marvel movie having a post-credit scene, which eventually translated to where just about like every movie ever had a post-credit scene. Now you see anytime a movie comes out, there's websites that have articles. Does this movie have a post-credit scene? Does this movie have a post-credit scene? Do you need to stick around after the credits? We have Marvel to thank for that. However, I do believe that post-credit scene is partially why this movie was so successful. Because I remember when Iron Man came out thinking, it's Iron Man, it's fine. I'm not really a big fan of Iron Man, I don't really care. But when I heard there was something big that happens after the credits that you have to go see, people were being very careful not to spoil it because they wanted people to see it for themselves. That's what convinced me to go to the theaters and see it. So I'm sure I was one of many people who weren't completely sold on Iron Man out of the gates, but when I heard there was something big that needed to be seen in the theater before it got spoiled, I had to go see it. And that was that scene. I remember I was shocked. I didn't know that we were getting an Avengers franchise. I didn't even know what it could look like. Or is it going to be the X-Men? Is it going to be Spider-Man? I didn't know all this stuff about how all the film rights were in different places. I just was like, oh my gosh, are we going to get to see the comic book universe come to life on the movie screen? I was so excited to hear what came next. And what came next? Well, we'll talk about that now. So our next movie in the series, The Incredible Hulk. That's your homework for next time. Make sure you watch The Incredible Hulk with Edward Norton, not Hulk with Eric Bana. Two very different movies. One has nothing to do with what we're talking about. One sort of has stuff to do with what we're talking about, because ultimately Ed Norton would get kicked out of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But we'll talk about that next time. So check that out. Do your homework. Be ready. Be prepared. And come back for another Marvel Monday. But before you go, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit the bell for notifications. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you leave me a comment below. Tell me what you thought of Iron Man. And do me one favor. Don't stand so close to me. Goodbye.